Hey, Govcon Giants family, your host Eric Coffie here with another exciting episode of the Govcon Giants podcast. And today we bring you from the esteemed law firm Hall & Knight, Mr. Eric Crusius, who's a partner out of Tyson's Corner. On this upcoming episode, we discuss regulatory issues as it relates to cybersecurity. We look back at the difference between policies between administrations from Obama to the current administration. We also talk about what are some of the services that Hall & Knight offers to small businesses, because if you're like me, you see a firm like Hall & Knight, you're thinking, I can't afford them. But in fact, they do offer services to small businesses, such as handling regulatory compliance issues. They look at if you have to file a protest, if you have to defend against a protest, negotiating prime and subcontract agreements, and things like that. So we get into all of that and more in today's upcoming episode of the Govcon Giants podcast.
All right. Eric, how are you today, sir?
Great. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you.
All right. Go ahead and introduce yourself and your company's name.
Sure. Eric Crusius. I'm a partner with Holland & Knight, a law firm, and I'm in our government contracts group.
All right. So Holland & Knight, obviously they cover a lot of areas. Is your government contracts group, is that one of the larger areas of specialties that you guys are involved in, or no?
I'd say so. The firm has 1,600 lawyers, so there's a lot of practice groups within the firm. But there's quite a few government contracts lawyers in our firm. We have one of the larger groups that are out there. We specialize in helping small, medium-sized businesses mostly, although I have some large business clients. Okay. But, just because our firm is large doesn't mean our client base is all large as well.
Thank you. That's a great distinction because, that would be an assumption I would have made.
Yeah. Most people make that assumption.
Yeah. No. And that's why, one of the reasons why we bring people like yourself on is to introduce you to, companies like myself and other small businesses that are looking for someone to turn to for help when we have questions about contracts and things like that. So tell me, what are some of the ways in which you or the people in your, what do you call it, division, or you call it group?
I guess group, our team. Our government
your team. Okay. So you're a government contracts team.
Yeah, that works.
Okay. All right. So on your government contracts team, what are some of the things that you do for small businesses?
So what don't we do? That's a better question. I mean, folks who are just use us for government contracts, for instance, we help them with compliance issues, knowing how to navigate a contracts issue that they have, negotiating with a prime contractor or a subcontractor when they're entering into an agreement, helping them with the pitfalls that come along with that. If they have a dispute with the government, helping them through that, navigating through that, negotiating with the government if there's a monetary dispute. If they don't win a contract, filing a protest. If they do win a contract, helping them get ramped up and maybe defending a protest that's been filed by the bidder who lost. All those kinds of things. And then obviously things can go sideways sometimes. So when they go sideways, helping them with those sideways problems and all the kinds of audits and things like that can happen.
Okay. All right. Now let's talk about, is there any, because I know there are, I just don't know them off the top of my head. Are there any new laws, regulations, anything that are affecting small businesses today that we should be concerned of, or is top of your mind?
Yeah, there's two things I think that are out there that really are impacting small businesses. One is the new cybersecurity requirements that the Department of Defense is putting out. And there will be on the civilian side too, but the more immediate is DoD. And there are a number of kind of stepstones that are happening along the way. And then I'll go into more detail if you want. But then the second thing is on the labor side, there's a lot of interesting developments there with the new non-displacement of qualified workers regulations, new $15 minimum wage, and new enforcement priorities that the Department of Labor has. So those are two things that I see impacting small businesses quite a bit.
Yeah, I did notice that when I was browsing through your profile, the wage and hour posted proposed regulations for non-displacement of qualified workers. Tell us, what does that mean?
So the non-displacement rules have been around in some form since the Clinton administration, and they're always put in place by a Democratic administration. They're always rescinded by a Republican administration.
Okay. All right.
So,
That's good to know.
I mean, GovCon is kind of like a test bed for politics, right?
It is. It is. No, it is. It is. It is. No, I believe you. I've noticed that even before I got into GovCon, I was working with a nonprofit, and then they said, depends on the administration if we're going to have a lot of funds or not so much funds, depending upon what administration's in office.
Yeah.
And again, I didn't really know what that. I mean, I knew what it meant, but I didn't understand how it varied so greatly.
Right. Yes. I mean, and you see it especially with labor stuff, and the non-displacement is a perfect example of it. Clinton had a very limited version of the non-displacement rules, which requires contractors to give offers of employment to the incumbent folks who are working on the contract when the new contractor kicks off.
Right. Okay.
With restrictions, and it's only applicable to Service Contract Act contracts. And then George W. Bush rescinded it in his first month in office. President Obama put in a much broader version. The executive order was issued his first month in office, but it took them 4 years to write and to implement the regulations. So it was January of his second term in office that the regulations were instituted. And then Trump didn't rescind them right away. He was probably doing other stuff. And on Halloween of 2019, they rescinded the non-displacement regulations that Obama put in. And then Biden didn't really issue the proposed regulations right away either. Again, probably had his mind on other things, but a couple months ago, he issued new proposed regulations on non-displacement, which are actually slightly broader than the Obama era regulations. So they keep getting kind of wider, for better or for worse, but the regulations keep getting wider. And the amount of ways that you can kind of not get out of the regulations, but the exceptions to the regulations are narrowing along the way.
Okay.
So there was an exception, for instance, in the previous version of the rules that the Obama administration issued that said, if you have your own staff that would get laid off, if you couldn't put them on this new contract, then you can displace those incumbent workers. That is gone now. There's no exception for that. Or another example is, I had a few instances during the last go run of these regulations where we had companies that didn't want to hire an incumbent worker because they weren't qualified, they're performing poorly.
Right.
But it's hard to get those things in writing, and it's hard to kind of quantify how poorly they're performing. So the standard of not giving somebody an offer because they're not performing well has been raised, where to the point where they would have to be fired if not brought on this contract. But the adjudication is that they deserve to get fired for whatever reason with the incumbent contractor. Again, very difficult to find that out from an incumbent contractor, because contractor who's working on the project and loses a contract is not about to give their employee files to the new contractor and help them out.
Right.
That's just not how it works. Even if they wanted to, there's probably some privacy issues associated with that. The incumbent workforce did not consent to have that old contractor give the new contractor. So there are exceptions that are there, but they're not real exceptions in a way. They're very difficult. And then you have this third party, the agency, who they're doing their work for. And the agency says, don't hire that person over there because we don't like them, or they're not qualified, or they're not doing a good job. And what is the contractor? This is a big problem I see with the regulations, and it played out in a case I had. The contractor's caught in the middle.
Right.
If the agency says somebody's not qualified, but there's no proof that they can present to DOL, that the contractor can present to DOL, and the agency says, don't hire this person, the contractor can't hire that person, because if you send in an invoice to the government based on a person the agency says is unqualified, you're looking at a False Claims Act violation right there, because you're billing for somebody that the agency's told you is not qualified. So you can't offer them employment. But then if that person who's not offered employment goes to DOL and complains, and DOL comes in and says, what proof do you have that they're not qualified? They can't perform the job. That's exactly a case I had actually a couple of years ago during the Obama administration when this was playing out. And DOL did side with the client, because the client, we were able to show that the person was not qualified. But it sure as heck took a lot of work to get there.
And this money, I'm sure money.
Yes. we don't like to talk about that.
Okay, I got you. All right, I
No,
forgot
I'm
yours.
just kidding.
I was saying it take a lot of work. It's a lot of work. Okay, lots of work. All right, all right.
Yeah, but that's not free, of course.
Sure.
And the contractor hired more than 99% of the workforce. Like that was the only person out of a workforce of 200 or 300 people that they didn't hire, but they went to complain, which that was their right to do. And DOL took the position that person was qualified, and we had to fight it out through litigation, through depositions and a trial to establish that the person was not qualified, even with the agency saying that they weren't qualified.
Why would they go through such an extent to for a single person?
So that's a good question. And the answer that you'll hear from Department of Labor is that, look, if you have a false Fair Labor Standards Act claim where you're not getting paid time and a half or something like that, you could file a lawsuit in federal court challenging that. You can hold the employer accountable for that. The Service Contract Act does not have a right does not give workers the right to file a lawsuit in federal court or state court or anywhere. The only way a violation of the Service Contract Act can be vindicated is through a complaint process with DOL. So DOL really takes those complaints seriously because they know that they are the only outlet for somebody to do something, to hold a contractor accountable or to vindicate the workers' rights if they need, if that's what it is needed. So they act as essentially the plaintiff's lawyer in those cases because of that.
Okay.
It seems a little strange sometimes because they're acting as the plaintiff's lawyer and also an administrative law judge with that same agency is adjudicating the case. So, does that seem very neutral to you? If
No.
the adjudicators, not really, but we did prevail
No.
in that one, but they have a pretty good record of prevailing on their cases. I find the ALJs to, on the whole, be very fair, but it doesn't strike outsiders as being fair because you have the plaintiff's lawyer essentially and the judge coming from the same place.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't realize, I knew that you had to hire the incumbent workers, but I didn't realize that they were changing that rule every time the party changed office. Because I had a friend of mine
go to college.
I'm sorry.
It said that's how my kids are going to go to college. They keep changing it. So
yeah, right, exactly.
Nice.
It's like, because I had a friend of mine that happened to him. He took over a contract to manage a facility, and two of the persons said they actually didn't want to work for the company. So when they were the ones that denied wanting to work for the company, the employment, and then they went back and took it up to DOL, and the DOL tried to rescind the contract and charge him a fine. And he said, look, and then they made some other claims, but it ended up going to an ombudsman. How do you say the word? Ombudsman?
Ombudsman, I think.
Ombudsman, right. It went up, there, and they ended up having, they basically hired private investigators to follow the guys around and just essentially capture what was happening and stuff. And they end up winning. But yeah, it's just, that's a tough one, right? When you're taking over a contract and you have to, so now tell me, okay, so now that Biden has put it back, that means that would only happen if you were actually doing I guess what I'm trying to say is it only affects the people who are taking over a contract like during that time. Right.
So there are only proposed regs again now. So we're waiting for final regulations.
Okay. Fair. Good point of clarification.
But even the last go around when the regulations were just proposed, some contracting officers did put like the executive order in the contract. And, if it's in your contract, you got to do it.
Yeah. Right.
Whether DOL will enforce it or not is another story, but you were agreeing with the agency that you're going to hire the incumbent workforce if it's in your contract. But this as well as anybody, the vast majority of folks on a contract are going to get hired.
Sure. Because they know how to do the job. I mean, that's what they're there every day. That's what they do. Right.
Yeah, it's far more disruptive and expensive for a contractor to bring in new workers each go around. So, this regulation is there for those kind of narrow cases, essentially, where an incoming contractor doesn't want to hire a certain swath of people for whatever reason, and to protect those workers. But it's a complicated rule, and the exceptions are complicated. And if the employer is not going to hire all the incumbent workers, it's incumbent on them to establish why they're not going to, because they're the ones with the burden. The employers are the ones with the burden to show why they don't have to. There are other exceptions too, like if you change a staffing plan, if the new contractor comes in and says, I know how we can do this contract much more efficiently, this service contract, that covered contract, we can use 5 workers instead of 7 by changing how they work on this building.
Sure.
Then they could do that. That's fine. But they have to pick from the pool of eligible incumbent employees. And within the first 90 days or so, if somebody quits, they have to go back to the pool of the folks they didn't give offers to initially and give them offers, as next in line. Hopefully those workers have found other jobs by then, but that's an option that they have too.
Are there any, and again, this applies for service contracts?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. Because those service contracts are the ones where I think the government values continuity. Construction is more, the project is done
right
when the contract's over and you move on to a different project.
Sure. So we didn't, I don't think we clarified so again, if Trump rescinded the rule, right?
Right.
I guess I'm in the clear if I took over, the contract during that time frame, right?
That's
and then between that time where he rescinded it and Biden, I guess, adds it back into the regulations, I'm free and clear.
That's right. So you technically don't have to worry about it at this moment, but that could change whenever the final regulations are issued.
Okay.
We don't know when that's going to be, of course, because the regulators, don't have a set schedule about when they're going to release these things. Fun fact about me, I check the Federal Register every morning at 8:45 or so, as soon as I can get on it, because I want to see what's new. It's actually kind of interesting to see what regulations have been released. Most of the time, there's nothing that's relevant for us, for the government contracting community.
Okay. So,
yeah. So
the Federal Register, and again, I didn't know this. So they release all regulations that affect everyone.
Yes. So, and the regulations are kind of drafted by agencies and they're put in one place on the Federal Register, and 8:45 every morning they're released. The ones that the agencies have put forward. So there's also a preview, which I didn't realize at first when I started checking years back. So there's the regulations that are and proposed regulations and notices that are relevant for that day come out at 8:45. They'll also have at 8:45 come out a little section on what is coming tomorrow, because everything has to be submitted a couple of days before. So they have a preview of what's coming tomorrow. It's not the official regulations
agenda
yet,
or whatever, but yeah.
It's like, but you get a draft, you get to see,
right.
And it's not really a draft in the sense that changes are going to be made at that point because it's going to come out the next day, but you get to see what's going to come out the next day also. So when I'm running a blog post, I always look at what's coming out tomorrow, because then I could get a head start on the blog and say, oh, something came out today and it looks like I drafted it in like an hour when it was really 25 hours maybe instead.
All right. You're telling some of your secrets here. I like it. I don't think anyone, by the way, is going to go steal that idea.
No. I'm the life of the party. I check the register every morning.
Yeah, right. I don't think anyone's going to steal your idea and go check the register in front of you.
Yeah.
So it's not like stock trading or anything like that. So I was like, let me get before Eric does it. So interesting. Now, another question. You brought up cybersecurity, but before we jump into cybersecurity, are there any other regulations like that change between parties and administrations? Anything else?
I'd say like the domestic preferences used to be like that, where domestic content that's required in manufacturing, but really that's an issue where the parties are aligned right now. Folks who supported Biden and folks who supported Trump can't agree on very much, but they do agree on raising the domestic content requirements for goods that are sold to the federal government.
See, so, I never saw that on the news, any stations.
That's right.
All right. So there is agree that we should have more content coming from the United States.
That's right. So that's one thing where you might have seen a shift between administrations before, but now they're Trump and Biden are kind of trying to outdo each other on how much we can go towards US based domestic content. But there is a certain limit of, we can't do 100% of everything all the time because we don't have the domestic capacity for that. We don't have the supply lines. These things take years to build up, to plan for and build up. Just a widget that's built, that's put into something else, just the molding and the tooling that's required is not it's not even a 1-year endeavor; it's a multi-year endeavor to
Right.
kind of get up to speed.
I have a kind of a tough question. I had someone that was on my podcast that they make cutlery, knives, forks, spoons, and that was one of those areas that it stated that it had to be, produced domestically. However, and again, I'm not saying you're the expert. I'm just bringing up this issue. So if you don't know it, it's okay. But it went to GSA, and it actually made the news. And GSA's response was when there was a company that was no longer providing their cutlery. It was manufactured overseas, but they were advertising as it was USA company, right? GSA said that they're not an enforcement agency. And so they took the position of we don't monitor or enforce compliance. We just simply state the rules, and they allow for procurement, right, between agencies and customers. They're like a portal.
Right. They contract the GSA contracting system. They're
Right.
Yeah.
So this particular podcast guest was trying to find out, how do you actually enforce that regulation? How do you enforce that? Whatever you call it, domestic preferences was what you state. We call it made in USA for simple people terms, but that's okay. Domestic preference is fine,
So there's two ways that they could enforce that. The first is you look to if GSA is just a portal, there is an agency that's actually ordering that cutlery.
Right.
So you go to that ordering agency because they're the ones that have some skin in the game, and they're the actual buyers. The second way is if the company that's selling the cutlery is misrepresenting itself as being sold in the United States when it's not, or being made in the United States when it's not,
right,
is to essentially file a complaint, like an IG complaint or something like that. And even anonymously, right? And just say, hey, this company is saying they're made in the USA. We know it's not true, because there are consequences for that. You've seen it where folks have represented things of being made in the US or not being from a certain origin, and it's not true. The government takes a lot of interest in that, and they'll run investigations just on that issue alone. I've seen it firsthand.
So they have to file with an IG complaint. I guess that's what the person probably didn't know.
That's probably the best avenue for something like that, is or file a complaint with the contracting officer, reach out to them directly. But I would say like an IG complaint of some kind is probably the easiest place to start. And if it's not the right place, they can point them in the right direction. But you definitely want to kind of focus on the ordering agency, I think.
Okay. No, I like that. All right. So now what the domestic preference is, how is that changing? Right. I'm a construction guy. We do a lot of construction projects. And I can tell you it is a challenge. All of my subcontractors complain. But then when I read the contracts, it says if, X, Y, Z percent, 80% or more, or whatever it is, you can't find it here, then it meets the regulations. But then I think that the contracting folks, have you found that contracting agencies, officers, sometimes they're not reading or interpreting it differently than you are? How's that?
Yes, and I don't.
That might be a better way of putting it.
Yeah, and yes, so, like sometimes, and it's not just with this, but with any other number of regulations, they're interpreting it a different way than I would, and then the client would. And I think it's hard to blame them, because you look at all the regulations they're in charge of knowing something about, and it's not dozens, it's over 100, I'm sure.
Right.
And to know like when it's applicable and how it's applicable, what it all means, is not an easy task. And that falls onto the government. First of all, we've had a lot of turnover in the contracting officer area over the last few years.
Oh my goodness. All my offices have like interns in them.
Yeah. And so, it's going to take a while to build that knowledge up. And I think the government, especially when there was sequestration a few years back, cut training spending a lot, training funding, and training is really a necessary part. You can't just, government contracts is just so specialized. It's not like any of us went to high school dreaming of going into government contracts, although we may like it now, but it wasn't, we didn't get schooling on it. So schooling is real life, and they need to get training so they can understand what the consequences of these regs are and how they work and how to implement them and things like that. So yeah, I think a lot of that just comes to interpretation, that differences of interpretation just is a consequence of the fact that they're in charge of knowing so much and have so little training, relatively speaking. That's why I'm really involved with the National Contract Management Association, NCMA, because I think that's a great spot where contractors and government folks can meet and chat about these kinds of issues. And the government folks who go to NCMA are very invested in their careers and are, by and large, a great group of folks at the government who you can talk to and work through these problems with.
That's good to know. I'm happy to hear that because, you know, oftentimes when when this is occurring, right, it's in the middle of a negotiation. So it's not exactly the best time to start talking, you know, to hashing out these issues.
Yes.
You know, and so it's not, you know, pre-negotiation or market research, or it's not, like you said, at a conference or convention. It's, hey, we've got to get this, you know, negotiation hatched out, and this thing's got to be done by, you know, because they've got pressure on spending, and the money has to be spent and it's allocated. So we've got to get this done by, you know, August the 13th. And you're saying, what are you? It's like, you know, we don't even, you know, we interpret this differently. So, okay, that's fair. That makes sense. So let's talk about cybersecurity for our last, you know, 15, 20 minutes here. What's going on with cybersecurity? You know, that's another, you know, I guess, an issue that's carried on for, I don't know, when did this originate? 10 years ago, 12 years ago?
Yeah, it was about, I'm trying to think, it's probably about 15, 16 years now.
Okay. There you go.
Yeah.
Right. So they've been threatening enforcement of this for so long. And now it seems like it's finally coming around.
Yes.
But I also read that they threw out the originals, or the latest CMC framework. They threw that out and redid it.
Yes, there's been a lot going on in this area. I remember I was speaking at a conference on cybersecurity it was about 10 or 12 years ago for NCMA, and they didn't have a cybersecurity track when they released the agenda, and I reached out to them myself and I said, whether you take mine or not, or somebody else's, you got to have a cybersecurity track. I think a lot of people were interested in this. This is an issue that's going to be emerging. And they relented and they agreed to give me a slot. And 4 people showed up. So I guess they knew better than me.
Right.
But, you know, now when we do cybersecurity things like that, it's not just 4 people showing up, because folks realize it's a big issue. Even if there isn't a technical regulatory requirement, it's, you know, companies want to protect their stuff because they know the consequence of not protecting it is so grave.
Sure.
Companies have gone out of business because of cybersecurity breaches.
Yeah.
So, so there's the civilian side and there's the DoD side. On the civilian side, we have a FAR regulation that's not too difficult to comply with, but other agencies have issued their own regulations, like NASA has, Department of State, Department of Transportation, the IRS. If you're doing business with the IRS, they have a 1-hour turnaround time for a breach response. So you have to tell the IRS within 1 hour that you've been breached, which is almost physically not possible.
Right.
And then you have the Department of Defense, which is kind of leading the way here in a lot of ways. And they issued, 5 years ago, they issued DFARS 252-204-7012, which if you have what's called controlled unclassified information, you have to protect that information using the NIST standard 800-171, but you have to tell DoD of a breach within 72 hours. And you have to open up yourself to a DoD investigation if there is a breach. So if DoD wants to come and investigate, they can do that. I went to a couple of presentations with DoD officials there after that regulation was released, and they were borderline angry because they're like, we know you're not complying with this regulation to the contracting community. We know that you're not complying with the 110 controls because there's just no way you're doing it based on the breaches that we're seeing. And we need to do something about that. So, that's on you, the contracting community, to protect this information. But we're losing, I'm paraphrasing here, of course, but they're essentially saying we're losing trust that you're actually doing what it takes to protect this information, because it's an expense and it's also difficult. So even contractors with the best intentions maybe aren't complying with the 110 controls. So they came up with CMMC, the cybersecurity maturity model certification, which had a third-party certification requirement saying, we're going to make sure that you contractors are protecting this info. So now it's on the third party. That first version of CMMC that you were talking about, that they eventually threw out, required this third-party certification for everybody doing business with DoD, all the way down the supply chain, except for COTS providers. If the levels were different depending on what kind of information, but even the folks without controlled unclassified information would have to get a certification. So even if you just had a contract to mow a lawn somewhere that didn't have any kind of information that was considered controlled unclassified information, you'd still have to get a third-party certification. They looked at the numbers of how many contractors would have to get certified and saw that was too big a hill to climb. And the biggest complaint was small businesses were being, adversely impacted because this is not a small expense.
Right.
My thought has always been from the beginning, and I've expressed this in a few different places, for the cost of like a quarter of a missile, DoD should give an allowance for small businesses to get up to speed and to get certified, and have that as an expense that is reimbursable. Show that you've incurred this expense, show that you've done work with DoD before, or whatever metrics you need to hit. But then DoD will reimburse you the expense, because that will ensure that the DoD information that's in the hands of these contractors is protected, because the contractors have nothing to lose by going out and protecting it.
Sure.
But they didn't listen to me. So then you had two new clauses that came out when this first CMMC clause came out in November 2020 that requires contractors. So we had this 7012 clause that's been in there for a number of years that requires contractors to comply with 110 controls. Then we had two new clauses that came out that said, we don't just want to take your word for it that you're complying with 110 controls. We need for you to physically go into a DoD system, under oath essentially, and say how many of those controls you're compliant with. And that caused a lot of contractors to take a second look and say, okay, now that we're going through each of these controls and saying that we're doing it or we're not doing it, that's a human nature thing. It's one thing to take a clause that's one of dozens of clauses that requires you to do something. It's another thing to have this clause that actually requires you to go into a DoD system and say how many of those controls you're compliant with. Right. And they got a lot of different answers, and
they were inconsistencies. Huh?
Yeah. And I've told contractors this, like, you have to think about that inconsistency. You've been kind of taking on this contract with this requirement. Now you're going and telling DoD, wait a minute, maybe we're not compliant with the 110 controls at this time. That being said, you got to tell the truth. So you just got to do it and take the medicine and explain to DoD why it happened. But then, we had a new administration come in, and CMMC 1.0, which required everybody to get a third-party certification, was scaled back in one spot where that basic information that contractors have does not require a third-party certification. It only requires a certification from a C-level person in the company, in that same system, by the way, to say you're compliant with the 17 or 18 controls on that first basic level if you don't have controlled unclassified information. So there are 3 levels now overall. The first one has basic information below the level of controlled unclassified. The second level is controlled unclassified information. And the third level is you have very sensitive information, including controlled unclassified information. So for those folks in that first level, you don't need a third-party certification anymore, but you do need to have a C-level person certify on the supplier performance risk system that DoD has that you're compliant with these 17 or so controls. If you look at the documents that DoD released about it, it's not like a weekend exercise to do that. It is something it's going to take a little bit of time and some thought, because the risk is on the contractor now. If something goes wrong, you don't have a third party kind of backing you up saying, oh, we looked at them and they were fine. It's all your independent judgment, which can leave a contractor open to like False Claims Act allegations and things like that. So those folks who are going to be self-certifying have to really take the time and be careful. The second level is still, for the most part, a third-party certification again. So those folks will get a third-party certification, which will not be inexpensive, but it will give the government assurances that they can handle this controlled unclassified information. Underlying all of this that I just talked about is what is controlled unclassified information, because compliance with the regulation, all these regulations I talked about, mean that you have some form of controlled unclassified information. And that definition is being applied inconsistently across the government and the contractor community, because the definition is not as clear as it could be. If you look at the regulation says refer to the CUI registry. There's a registry online, but then you look at the registry and it's like fitting a round peg in a square hole. It's not as clear as it could be. So President Obama in 2010 issued an executive order telling folks, you got to clarify this. The regulations, and issue regulations about it. The regulations have not yet been issued. We're 12 years later. They opened up a case in 2017, 7 years after the executive order, to issue the regulation. And the case has been open for 5 years. Looked like they were on the verge of releasing the regulation a couple months ago, but now there's some inconsistency in the language if you look at the latest status of it. And they're working to resolve those issues. So who knows when it'll come out, but that might go a long way of helping clarify what is controlled unclassified information. So that way, that'll help all these programs work better. And then Congress saw that too. In last year's NDAA, 2022 NDAA, said to DOD, you got to clarify what controlled unclassified and federal contract information is. So we haven't seen it, but there was a report that was due 180 days after the NDAA was passed. You know how those reports work. They'll come out when they come out. So we haven't seen that report yet that I know of, at least anyway, unless it's hidden somewhere on the web that I have not been able to sleuth. But yeah, so that's what's new in cyber. So what else, if I had to say one thing to small businesses, is the time to get ready for this CMMC is now, because it's going to roll out next year. And it takes a good 9 to 12 months to kind of get up to speed on it, to get your systems ready, to get ready for an audit. And we don't know when folks are going to be required to get an assessment, because it's going to kind of roll out across different contracts as time goes on. So by the time you find out your contract's up, it may be too late, because it's going to take longer than the time you need, once you find out.
All right. So let's go back to the 3 levels. I know that the 3rd level is sensitive information. Can you go over level 1 and level 2 again?
Sure. So level 2 is controlled unclassified information. So if you have controlled unclassified information, you're covered by that level.
Okay.
So contracts that involve controlled unclassified information will be tagged as a level 2 contract, and contractors that are awarded a contract that are tagged with level 2 will have to have that level 2 certification.
Okay.
Now they have a supply chain of subcontractors. We don't know this for sure, but the thought is that the subs won't uniformly have to have a level 2 certification. Some could have a level 1 self-certification if they're not going to handle the controlled unclassified information. Maybe they're doing something that's unrelated to it. And in that circumstance, you could have people in your supply chain that are level 1, but everyone in the supply chain all the way down, except for the COTS providers, commercial off-the-shelf products, will have to have some sort of certification. When you're looking at level 1, it's the more basic. We don't have controlled unclassified information. We just have federal contract information, which could be the contract itself, could be considered FCI, or more basic information that is generally not public, but is not particularly sensitive to the government. Really, everyone who's in the DoD supply chain will at least have to have a level 1 certification once this fully rolls out. And I'll say this: the level 1 tasks, what you have to do to meet level 1, are probably things from a cybersecurity hygiene standpoint, or things that companies should be doing anyway.
Right.
And there's probably, most companies of any size are probably doing them already.
Right.
But it's a matter of validating that. You have to show your work essentially, or have the work have DoD able to be seen the work if they come back and essentially audit a contractor who's self-certified that they're compliant.
Okay. All right. No, that's good stuff. I like it. I'm gonna let you. You said some things about that. I mean, it makes sense, right? Again, we all should be aware or concerned about cybersecurity threats. I know that now it's impacting insurance premiums as well for companies, and so again, having some of these things will cut down the cost of the insurance providers. Not having them will increase your cost of insurance, and so this is becoming the new standard. I was hoping, because I've heard some rumors that people were going to be creating these black boxes that you could put all your information in and protect you, right? Like you, and so you wouldn't have to do any of this stuff, right? Like I'm still waiting on that black box to come out, but I hope someone solves the problem where it's like, hey, all my information goes to a black box first that has that meets all the requirements, and then it comes out to the government compliant, right?
There's no black box, but there are things they're doing to make it a little bit easier. Like your whole corporate enterprise does not have to be certified. You can have say, this little area here is where we have our controlled unclassified information. So this is what's going to get assessed here.
Okay.
So it can be cheaper and simpler that way. Yeah, so it's like a gray box maybe. But you could kind of create your own little environment that is assessed instead. But then you have to make sure that's the only spot where controlled unclassified information goes or is created. I think a big mistake people make who are not yet subject to CMMC, because nobody really is yet, but who have the 7012 clause that's been around for a few years now. They say, I don't have controlled unclassified information because the government hasn't marked anything. And if you look at the clause itself, there's no marking requirement. It's marked by the government or created, stored, transmitted, et cetera, by the contractor. So you can have a big warning out there for folks. You can have controlled unclassified information, even if it's not marked. Because the government, first of all, if you're creating it, the government's not going to be able to mark it. And second, the government doesn't always mark it, even if they should. So, you have to be careful that I've had that conversation with a number of folks that have told me that they don't have controlled unclassified information. I say, because it's not marked, I say, let's go to the clause. I want to show you something. There's an or here. It's not an and. So it can be marked or fit these other categories.
What is that thing they taught you? Ignorance of the law has no excuse or something.
Yes.
Something to that effect. All right. Well, listen, I want to be respectful for your time. Why don't you go ahead and close us out with some parting words for small businesses? So we'll shut it down.
Sure. I mean, what I'd say for this to small businesses is that this whole area can seem daunting. I think the key is just to have good folks you can lean on, who you trust to kind of work through these issues, because if you can, this is a very rewarding area to work in. And, government's a huge customer. So it's worth dealing with them, even with these headaches sometimes.
No, Eric, I appreciate that. I know we're short on time today, but I definitely want to come back on and talk about subcontracting plans. That's an area it came to my brain as we were talking. And so I said, look, I definitely get you back on to talk about subcontracting plans. So we'll make some arrangements for that.
Sure. Sounds like a plan.
Well, listen, Eric, thank you hey man, thank you so much for coming on today. Thanks for sharing. I loved all this information. It's great. I took a bunch of notes, and I know that my guests are listening to this as well. And so people are going to be wanting to know, hey, I hope that everyone's going back and asking their CIOs, CTOs, or whoever's handling their CISOs, if this stuff is happening, if it's in place. So thanks so much, Eric, for making us aware and putting the issues on the table so that people can at least have the information and they can elect or choose to make the best decisions for their businesses. So I want to say thank you again.
Sure. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Thanks. I'll see you.
Bye.
Bye.